Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. They say that timing is everything, and my guest on this episode has shown impeccable timing with her new book. Margaret Heffernan is the author of Uncharted, How to Map the Future, which explores the topic of uncertainty. We're all addicted to prediction and like to have certainty about what will happen in the future. Yet as we're seeing at the moment, the reality is that life is anything but certain. What Margaret explores in Uncharted is our obsession with having certainty and the damage that can do. As we're seeing during the corona crisis, organisations that have run on extreme efficiency are being severely challenged when the normal dynamics no longer apply. In Uncharted, Margaret looks at how we can better respond to uncertainty by embracing it and working on the basis that the world isn't predictable. She didn't write it with the coronavirus in mind, but the book serves as a guide for us to think about how to handle the sometimes unfathomable dynamics of the world we live in. During our conversation, we explore uncertainty, and Margaret shares some of her ideas about how we can adjust our ways of thinking to make ourselves and our societies and organisations more future-proof. I first came across Margaret through her book on willful blindness, which the Financial Times described as one of the most important business books of the decade. She used to work in television and is now a professor of practice at the University of Bath. She's also a regular contributor to the Financial Times and mentors CEOs and senior executives of major global organisations. In her writing and thinking, she tackles big issues head-on, and Uncharted is no exception. Please enjoy my fascinating conversation with Margaret Heffernan. Margaret Heffernan, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, it's really great to be talking to you, Christian.
You couldn't have chosen a more interesting time to be launching your new book, and I obviously want to come on and look at some of the dynamics in it. But to kickstart us off, what inspired you to write this?
Well, it's interesting because, as you know, it's a book that the first third of which it explains why we really can't forecast the future. And many people have said to me, well, wow, Margaret, for somebody who's very skeptical about forecasting, you seem to have made the timing just right? But actually, it stemmed from two completely trivial things that stuck in my head. And the first was a friend of mine who said one night to me, she said, you know, if I knew I was going to live to be 95, I'd drink more. I mean, I obviously have a warped sense of humor, but I thought that is such a funny comment because if you drank more, you wouldn't live to not be 95. But it's a beautiful, beautiful paradox. And the second thing was during the time in the run up to the Brexit referendum and the Trump election, people kept asking me over and over again, Margaret, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I thought, well, why do you think I know? And also, why do you even think it's knowable? Because people are changing their minds every day. It's not fixed in stone. And I think what those two things did, from radically different sources, is they really got me thinking about how is it that people think about the future. And I did lots and lots of reading about the whole history of forecasting, from the Greeks onwards, and, read a lot about how science fiction writers think about the future and just kind of wallowed in weird stuff about the future and eventually emerged, not a lot more intelligent, I have to say, thinking we just think about the future all wrong. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, if that's the case, think how much depends on it. And then I came across Philip Tetlock's work. He's written a magnificent book called Super Forecasting. I had spent some time talking to him. And, really the people who understand forecasting better than anybody will say that the very, very, very best people can only come up with reasonably reliable probabilistic forecasts 400 days out. And the rest of us, mere mortals, maximally, when we're really thoughtful, 150 days out. And I love nerdy data points like that, and my brain chews them up. And I thought, well, the whole of modern management is based on this, what I think of as a three-legged stool, which is forecast, plan, execute. and the first leg's broken. So that means the other legs, that means the chair doesn't work. So if that doesn't work, what do we need to be doing instead? And, as you probably know, since you know my work so well, I don't tend to ask terribly small questions.
No.
So this sent me off, onto a very kind of long, deep think about, okay, so if the old stuff doesn't work, what might work? And I think, really central to this was the belief or understanding that uncertainty is not a bad day. Uncertainty is not something that just happens occasionally and then if we're smart enough, we eliminate it. Uncertainty is always, always with us. And I think that technology really has blinded us to that fact and encouraged us, in fact, to believe that life is predictable. If we have enough big data and enough super smart software, then we can render all of life predictable. And it's very obvious that if that has been the project of Silicon Valley, that it's failed. And I think it's becoming obvious that it's the wrong project. So that, in a rather large nutshell, is kind of how the book started to develop.
And I mean, it's fascinating when sort of reading it, you explore lots of other examples of models, both financial models, spreadsheet models, but sort of models of the way of running businesses.
Yeah,
that are just clearly, an attempt to sort of control something that is uncontrollable. And we've seen, for example, supply chains. That seems like a really good idea to have just-in-time supplies until you can't deliver on them or demand changes. And then the whole thing, as we've seen with supermarkets, gets thrown up in the air. Yeah. And so I found it fascinating as we were going through to see quite how many models we use and rely on to predict the future. And did it surprise you how many you discovered as you were looking at things?
Well, I don't think it surprised me how many of them there were. What really surprised me was how much faith we put into them. Because really every model is, by definition, a simplified version of the world. And they are helpful because obviously trying to encompass the whole of the world in our brains is overwhelming. So we have to simplify it. But the defining characteristic of a model is that it leaves stuff out. And if we're lucky, it doesn't leave out the really important stuff. But then that means we have to decide what the important stuff is. And what's important today may not be important tomorrow. Having large stockpiles of hand sanitizer 2 months ago was not important. It turned out very quickly to be more important than any retailer could cope with. And so the difficulty with models is that in order to be perfect, you have to know what the future is. But the difficulty of the model is that they're trying to decide what the future will be. So you're stuck in a kind of impossible paradox. And the real danger of models is that business people and political leaders too quickly start to mistake the model for the reality. And they start thinking, well, this is the truth. And they forget that it's saturated with value judgments and it's saturated with assumptions which are maybe very sound and rational, but which can and do change in an instant.
And of course, there are plenty of examples of where we've got better at doing things. If I look at medical development, clearly we are better at dealing with that. If I look at something like weather forecasting, we are better at, you might not believe it when you watch weather forecasts, but we're better at predicting weather patterns than we have ever before. So it's in a way, it's comprehensible that we've got ourselves in a position where we feel like we're in control. And that feels like quite a nice place to be because it's less for us to think about and we can kind of operate more on autopilot. So to a certain extent, it's not possibly not surprising that we cleave so much to it because it is quite comforting.
That's right. And of course, you put your finger on it. Autopilot is the problem because it's not that models aren't helpful. They are helpful, but they're specifically unhelpful when we depend on them too much. I mean, so there are two really quick examples I'd give. Most of us use GPS, especially when we're going to somewhere we've never been before. It will give us an expected time of arrival. And sometimes that's correct. One of the things I've noticed, because I travel a lot, is the further the distance, the less reliable it is. And about 2 months ago, I went to teach a school of Welsh civil servants. It estimated that from my house, the journey would take 3.5 hours. It took 5.5 hours. And the thing is, I knew it wasn't going to take 3.5 hours. I knew that was impossible, right? So, and one of the things with GPS is it's using lots and lots of data, right? But it also doesn't know when a cat's run into a road and a car is slammed on the brakes and there's a pileup. And the pileup may only last 30 minutes. It may be long gone by the time you get there, but it's changed the whole system. It doesn't know when a kid runs into the road or when a lorry falls over. And so the longer the distance, the less reliable it will be. And equally, exactly the same thing with weather forecasting, which has improved enormously in the last 20 to 30 years. But the other day I was thinking I would invite my in-laws over for drinks, several meters away from me in my garden. Because the weather was so nice. And then I looked at the weather forecast and it said, no, but on Friday it's going to be raining. But every day when I checked the weather forecast, it had changed until on Friday morning, it turned out to be accurate, right? By the time I got there, it was correct, right?
Right.
This is the thing, which is that the element of time introduces a sort of equivalent element of uncertainty. So you're pretty you're going to get things pretty right if you're very close to what you're predicting. I'm probably safe at predicting, in an hour from now, I'll probably have a cocktail with my husband. But if you ask me, what am I going to be doing a year from now? Forget it. No idea. So and of course, the difficulty here is we use forecasting more for things that are far away in the future, but that's where they most let us down. So this really is, I think, a kind of inescapable conundrum. And yes, we can spend a lot of time and effort and money, as many companies do, trying to get the predictions a little bit better. But I think we also have to just take a deep breath and accept that the future is not predictable. And therefore, we have to change the way that we think about planning, about management, and about preparing.
And one of the things that I really enjoyed thinking about as I was reading the book was this idea that actually having unpredictability is not necessarily a negative. And so you talk about the arts as a really good example of something where unpredictability is inherent. I think you said that artists don't try and future-proof their work, which I thought was a lovely articulation. And so there are some real positives that come from that. And we seem to have kind of filtered those out because the advantage that we see societally is in predictability. And therefore that doesn't allow things like serendipity and randomness to enter in joyous as well as unjoyous ways.
Well, it also sort of doesn't allow for experimentation, for exploration. I mean, I think of when I worked at the BBC and I was promoted at least once a year and had a very flourishing career, first in radio and then in television, and you would have said, as many people did, that I would rise higher and higher and higher in the ranks of television and I would be a television executive for the rest of my life. And everybody would have thought that looks completely predictable. Well, many things happened. The first was my husband died when I was 30. The second was that about 6 years later, I decided to move back to the United States. Without any planning at all, I ended up running technology companies. And 8 years after that, I decided, right, that's enough of that. I want to come back to England and become a writer. That is not predictable if you're looking at my life, at the time that I'm, shooting a time watch program. It's absolutely not predictable. And, I could spend the whole of our time together talking about people whose careers kind of opened up and shut down and opened up and shut down. And I think we do our young people a huge disservice when we bring them up with this concept that, you go to college, you get a degree, the degree sends you down a particular path, and that's it, you're done. This isn't realistic. And I don't think it's very much fun to think about either, because certainly talking to the young people I teach and work with, they don't especially feel confident that there is one thing in life that is going to define them for the next 50, 60, 70 years. The decision is too daunting, and it doesn't speak to their desire to find out what they're made of. And the truth is they may have multiple careers, and that will allow them to discover and develop more parts of themselves. So I think this whole picture of human life as, make the right decisions and then you're on the right road and then you hand over, as you say, to autopilot. I think it's dull. I think it's very misleading. And I think it's extremely poor preparation for a life in which really that's just not the way it's going to be.
And as you were talking, I was reflecting on my own career, which is
right, exactly.
Pinball-esque would be polite. It bounces around. And of course, the temptation is that I feel the need to write a with hindsight narrative that runs along the lines of I did this, and then of course I did that, and then of course I did that, which is absolutely retro-filled logic. Right. That sort of, has, with the benefit of hindsight, I can create a narrative that justifies and explains it, because I almost feel that need to have a story to tell.
Yeah.
When in truth, it's I randomly met someone, they offered me something. I've made some really bad decisions and some really good ones, and some of them weren't even decisions at all; they were foisted on me. Right. And so this is clearly ingrained in our thinking that we need to have that narrative and that story to be able to sort of make sense of the world.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is that story doesn't describe at all how it feels at the time. It neither describes the anxiety nor the elation. And it doesn't describe a story that's full of growth. It's just a kind of one foot in front of the other story. And I think there are two problems here. The first is that it seeks to deprive the individual of a sense of agency, that actually their life is theirs to make. It hasn't been made for them. I think there's that thing. And it also, I think, writes off a lot of people. So I was having a rather fierce argument with a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist who was talking about all these, young people whose, terribly desperate upbringings have really, as she saw it, doomed them. And I thought, this is all wrong. I mean, I absolutely understand, growing up in a poor background with, difficult parents who may not give you much love and attention. I understand that that's difficult and painful and it impinges on life chances. But the minute you start thinking of these individuals as doomed, you undervalue them. And that's a short step to allowing society to write them off. And we can't do that. We have no right to do it because it isn't true. And as you will know, there's a story in my book of a young man who's, the first half of his life is, it looks like the absolutely classic tragic descent into failure and catastrophe. And that is not the story of his life. And some of it's because of accident, and some of it's because by some fluke he made a good decision on a particular day, in the same way that on a particular day made a bad decision. But, if we want people to take responsibility for their lives, we have to acknowledge that they have agency in their lives. And I think this tendency to categorize people and type people and put them in boxes and decide that their future is fated is patronizing and authoritarian.
And I think, as we've seen, particularly, I can look at the UK as where I live. There is a deference to a certain type of person, and we've seen this in politics, where people with a certain type of accent it's a very strange dynamic that we have in the UK, where a lot of the last few male prime ministers have all been to the same school.
Yeah.
And so there is sort of doffing of caps and tugging of forelocks to people who happen to have had the right education or a certain education. I won't want to call it the right education, who speak a certain way. And you're right, this ingrains huge amounts of sort of societal behavior where they just disapply critical thinking because I'm not allowed to think about these things. It's above my station. Yeah. I can't possibly contemplate anything else. And that's very destructive from a human endeavor, human capital perspective.
Well, I think that's right. But I also think that it's only one way in which we put people into boxes. A large number of global corporations also use psychological profiling, of which probably the most famous is the Myers-Briggs. And, so people get these formula for what they are, and they're also told that what you are never changes. Now, I think telling somebody that they're an agglomeration of 4 initials is idiotic. I think the Myers-Briggs test has no statistical validity. It's based on models that I think are outmoded and outdated. And the idea that people don't change flies in the face of one of the greatest discoveries of our lifetime, which is the discovery that our brains change every minute of our lives until the second that we die. So I think this idea that we can know people, type people, profile people is insidious and uncreative. And I think, in the same way, I'm not my Facebook profile. I'm not my Amazon profile, or they'd stop recommending that I buy books I've already written. It's alarming to me how fast my Spotify profile gets me to music that I detest. I mean, this is horoscopes. It's all horoscopes, and it's not bad as entertainment. But in terms of informing how people make decisions about themselves and their careers and their lives and their businesses, it's just snake oil.
But I find that interesting when you talk about I'll describe it as the glitch in the matrix, right? Mm-hmm. So Amazon has recommended you something that is patently daft. And Spotify's driven you down into musical hell. So all of those things, I see them, and it's a failing of it demonstrates precisely that the algorithm isn't working. Now, it's doing what it's been told to do, right, but it's not working on a human level, and it's delivering the wrong answer. And therefore, your perception is it's not delivering, and therefore it isn't delivering because you're the customer in this particular situation. But I quite like those because I look at that and go, there is a reminder here that these things still aren't perfect. And so I sort of look at it and go, it's the kind of Achilles heel that gives me reassurance. The moment these things operate or appear to operate 100% correctly is super scary, but also I think encourages that piece. So I think, we occasionally need our GPS systems to fail to send us on the dirt track so that we can maintain that critical thinking faculty.
Yeah. So I agree with you, but I think that the answer to this isn't, let's get the algorithm better. I think the answer is, let's not believe the algorithm, right? I mean, at one point, choosing book titles is always notoriously painful. And at one point, I wanted to call the book after a quote from a Spanish poet, "The path is made by walking." And I thought it was a very beautiful poetic title, which is why nobody else liked it. But what I was trying to articulate with that is that who we are is made by what we do. The path isn't there. It only emerges when you walk. And so the important thing is we are not a fixed thing. We're not an object. We're not a fixed creation. We are a dynamic entity that is constantly going through change, evolution, adaptation. And so the algorithm is always going to be wrong because it doesn't know what we're going to do tomorrow and who we're going to be next week. And I think one of the things that really interested me when I was doing some of the research for the chapter on how artists think is the director, Peter Brook, who's regarded as one of the greatest directors in theater today, said the director who starts on a play is not the same person who finishes it. That what we do changes who we are. It doesn't confirm who we are. When we decide to do a job or a piece of work or a holiday or whatever, what the experience means that we come out of it changed. That's why we travel, right? It's why we go to museums. It's why we read books. It's why we have conversations with people. Not to just maintain the status quo, but to discover more in the world and more in ourselves. And so we are literally always a moving target. And that's one of the glories of human existence.
And I love that depiction. And of course, this is a particularly interesting time to talk about how experiences are shaping us, because we're clearly as a society going to emerge, and each of us individually will emerge differently from this situation, and that's talking as if this situation is suddenly going to close. There'll be someone will announce it's over and we can come out from hiding. Yeah. It's not going to be like that anyway. So we're evolving and changing on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's fascinating, the way you talk about us as sort of malleable, changeable beings rather than being predefined ones. I mean, how do you see the current situation? He said, getting onto the topic that I'm sure you're sick to death of talking about. How do you see that sort of playing out with the dynamics you've talked about?
Well, I think really that epidemics are they're the epitome of uncertainty, because they are generally certain. We know that there are always epidemics. And there always have been, and there's no reason why there shouldn't always be epidemics. But they are specifically ambiguous, which is to say we can't predict when they will break out, we can't predict what the disease will be, and we don't know where they will break out. So that's the uncertainty around them. And there isn't anything we can do about that. So that means that all the ways that we traditionally have thought about the future in terms of planning and forecasting simply won't work. And what it means is that we have to think in a very different way, which is, okay, if an epidemic were to break out, what would we wish we had in place, not because we can prevent it, but to minimize the damage that it does? And of course, had we asked that question, instead of arguing about, well, will it happen, which is a pointless question, had we asked that question, we would not, for example, have had already 100% capacity in ICU. We would not have slimmed down supplies of protective clothing, of ventilators, of doctors, of nurses, of staff in care homes. We just wouldn't have done any of that, because we would have thought, actually, it looks a little bloated at the moment, but actually if there's a real pressure on the system from an epidemic or some kind of industrial accident or a catastrophe, we need that to be responsive. So what we can't be in situations where we don't know the future, what we can't afford to be, is perfectly efficient, because efficiency strips out all of our capacity to respond. Instead, we have to think about being prepared for whatever life is going to throw at us. Now, that doesn't mean you prepare extravagantly for everything, but you do think about where are the situations which are likely and which will have a massive impact. And in those areas, we cannot let efficiency be the guiding light, because the danger of being wrong is too great. And I think in general, we have not done that kind of thinking about the future around what are the very big risks where the impact will be huge. We've treated everything as if it's equally forecastable, and we've treated everything as if making it more efficient will be an asset. And in that, we've been dangerous and sadly wrong.
I'm very much struck by what I see Bill Gates is doing at the moment, who, of course, demonstrates that what's going on at the moment was, as you say, predictable. What I thought was really interesting was his recent announcement that he was going to pay for factories to prepare so that all of the vaccines are capable of being made. And therefore, he's starting out with the premise of I'm not even sort of factoring in some redundancy. I know that the majority of these things aren't going to be used, but I recognise that that's what we have to do.
Yeah, so I think that's marvelous. But people who read my book will see that that's exactly what the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation started doing when it was very first founded 3 years ago. And to be fair to Gates, he was one of the early founders. He didn't inaugurate the coalition, but he came into it quite early, thank goodness. But what the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, which goes by the name of CEPI, what it did was really brilliant when it got up and started. And I was lucky enough to interview Richard Hatchett, who runs CEPI, when I think he was 6 months into the job. And he made this really brilliant distinction between what he called just-in-time thinking and just-in-case thinking. And he said, the just-in-case thinking is what's the stuff we will wish we had when bad stuff happens. And let's start working on that now, just in case. And as far as epidemics are concerned, you want two things just in case. The first is you really want vaccines a long way down the road of development, because vaccines are really hard to develop. They take years. Lots of the candidates fail. And so you want to get a really early start on it. And the second thing that Hatchett determined is that you want fantastically good relationships with epidemic response teams on the ground, because cultural and social issues will determine whether or not people accept those vaccines. So you're in a situation where you're going to throw a lot of money at vaccine development and network building, some of which you'll never use. That isn't efficient, but you've got to do it. But then there's another piece, which is when you've got the vaccine and you've got the network that can get it out to patients, what you need is super, super fast, super safe vaccine manufacturing. And that's a just-in-time process. And the pharma industry as a whole doesn't really care about speed. But in epidemics, speed is everything. So what CEPI also started doing was putting in place all the contracts that they needed with manufacturers so that the minute there's a successful vaccine, you can start cranking them out in hundreds of thousands. So this thinking is not, it has to be said, brand new. It can't be brand new because I wrote it in my book, which took but it is hugely important to apply this model to anything where there is a large degree of uncertainty and where there's the risk of a high impact, which is to think about where can we use efficiency, where do we really need it, and how do we get that in place quickly, but also where do we throw efficiency out and think, yes, we're going to waste some time and some money and some effort, but we simply can't afford not to.
When you were talking about sort of the way we think about, what might happen, of course, there's that famous Donald Rumsfeld set of known knowns and unknown knowns. And at the time, he was massively pilloried for it. But I can't help thinking that with the benefit of hindsight, he was sort of onto something, wasn't he?
He was absolutely onto something. And I think he was pilloried for it, because it made him sound like an intellectual, which in the Bush presidency was, definitely a no-no.
Undesirable, yeah.
Yeah. And also because it sounded so abstract. But, it also cropped up when I was writing my book, Willful Blindness, because there are the sort of, the unknown knowns, which actually may be knowable. It's just we choose not to know them. And then there are things which are genuinely unknowable, like when the next pandemic will be and what disease it will be and where it will break out. That is unknowable. It is absolutely unknowable, but it is not unknowable that it will happen somewhere, sometime, some disease. So you have to be prepared to do something which, business organizations and governments hate doing, which is to take action before you have full information. And one of the interesting things, thinking about CEPI and epidemic preparedness, CEPI really grew out of the Wellcome Trust. And the Wellcome Trust, which is the biggest medical charity in the world, or medical research funder in the world, is currently headed up by Dame Elizabeth Manning and Buller. And she used to run MI5. Now, this looks like a weird career too, right? But think about it for a second. Because both in intelligence at MI5 and in thinking about pandemics, you're talking about things which are generally certain. There will be terrorist attacks, and specifically ambiguous. We don't know where, we don't know who, we don't know how. So she's a fantastic thinker about how to do really good work in the absence of comprehensive information. And I think there are many a business leader who has a lot to learn from that. Because just because you don't know the future perfectly and in detail does not mean you can't act. It just means you have to think about your decision making in a very different way.
And she's a lovely example, I think, of a dynamic that I want to pick up on around the skill sets that we need to be able to handle this. Absolutely. So you've talked about acceptance is the first piece, right? So we have to accept that things are going to be uncertain. Yeah. We can embrace it, and we say that has some positive benefits. But we also, I think, need to, as you outline in the book, we need to equip ourselves with a skill set that makes us capable of dealing with it and able to sort of surf the wave, if you like.
Yes, I think that's right. And you have to think that, you're always going to be dealing with inadequate information, because by the time you have all the information, it's too late, right? So you have to become uncomfortable with uncertainty. You have to think about, in the context of the decision you have to make, how much certainty is enough? How much must I know? And you also have to take a deep breath and accept that you could still be wrong. You can do your absolute best, and it still won't work out the way that you want it to. And what that means is that the public also has to understand that when things go wrong, sometimes, people made mistakes. Sometimes it's just impossible to get it right. And we have to stop kind of shaming and blaming people all the time for everything, and just think instead, did they ask the right questions? Was their intent good? And what have we learned from this? Rather than who can we hang from the nearest lamppost?
I mean, of course, there are two global leaders who always get things right, one of whom runs North Korea and the other one sits in the White House. Yeah. But it is interesting that there is this narrative that has been allowed to be built up, both from the public's expectation that we want to see strong leadership that gets things right, and equally the politicians feel that they need to be able to sell visions and dreams, and so this idea of admitting you got something wrong is seems to be sorely lacking in certain quarters, and sadly in precisely those quarters where it's really necessary. And that seems to me a very important, you mentioned it, so said we need to accept that. But that's a big ask given where we stand at the moment in terms of the way people have been sold things. If I think of, for example, Brexit, some of the things that were promised, it hasn't taken too long to be apparent are not deliverable. And yet there's no way people can row back from that.
And there ought to be a way where people can say, actually, I have better information now. And in the light of new information, a better decision is now possible in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, most lawyers write into contracts changed circumstances, right? The situation is different now, so we need to do things differently. And I think the absurd rhetoric around U-turns is really unhelpful, because what it does is it makes people stick to stupid ideas, way, way, way past their original relevance. But I think there's a deeper issue here too, which is that we've become very, kind of addicted to what I think of as a very almost infantile political dialogue, which is that we like everything to be binary. It's a yes/no answer. When are we going to do this or that? Is it going to be good or bad? Is this person good or bad? And I was fascinated the other day. I was listening to, I think the Today program at, some horrible hour, like, 6:10.
I'm very uncivilized.
Right? And they had a professor of ecology on, and they were asking her, should the wet markets in China be banned? And she gave a very beautiful answer about the degree to which, A, the wet markets are what the poor depend on, B, if they go underground, that makes them even perhaps more dangerous, C, that actually there are many, many other sources of pandemics, so it actually might not have any impact whatsoever. And then she said, this is a very complex system, and I can't give you a yes or no answer. And despite the early hour, I just wanted to jump out of bed and cheer. I thought, thank you. She's right. It's a complex system. Yes or no is not helpful. We have to look at the whole ecosystem and instead ask, what is the best place to intervene where we do least harm to people and maximally improve how we reduce epidemics? This is a how question. It's a where question. It is not a childish multiple choice yes or no question. And much in the world is complex, and we have to stop pretending that it's simple.
I was sort of, as you were talking there, and I'm going to check that interview out because that sounds fascinating and incredibly refreshing. But and it strikes me there is something in this, and I'm conscious of all the biases associated with what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is that there is something out there. If you look at the female leadership that we see at the moment, whether it's the Merkels of this world or plenty of other examples, there seems to be a shift away from the kind of macho winner loser type rhetoric that we see from certain other male leaders. And I wondered, what's your sort of perspective on that and helping us? Does diversity, but starting with male, female, but broadening out to cognitive, does that help us navigate some of these challenges?
It's an interesting question. I mean, let's face it, the data set's awfully small.
Right. Yeah, I was conscious of survivorship bias as I was telling that story.
And I would also say that leadership studies is a pretty dodgy business because it's very easy to associate success with the person in charge at the time. But that means you don't take into account, successful leaders having really dodgy, stupid opponents. It doesn't take into account all the superb people that they work alongside. It doesn't take into account luck. It doesn't take into account lots of things. So I'm extremely wary of the attribution errors that absolutely bedevil leadership studies. I mean, the other thing I would say, because I've written, as you probably know, quite a lot on female leadership, I think in general, whether in business or government, women are extremely wary of what I think of as the celebritization of leadership. And they're wary of it because what has happened to women historically is first they're puffed up, yay, a female leader, and all sorts of completely irrational expectations are projected upon them. And then when they so much as chip a fingernail, they're dragged down into the gutter as absolutely useless and out of control. And so women leaders have learned, keep cool. Keep calm, don't overpromise, don't let them turn you into a celebrity, turn up in the morning and do your job. And so I think, for me anyway, that's the bigger lesson here, which is if you want to be a really good leader, A, listen, B, listen, C, think about not letting the power and not letting the fame get to you. It will destroy your mind. We see this every time a prime minister stays in office too long, right? Power is really dangerous to the people who hold it, not just because of what they might do with it, but what it does to them. And so I think women have seen so many women ride this roller coaster from, saint to outcast, that they just know it's not going to get them where they want to go.
I mean, that is just a fascinating insight and thinking, because, my primitive solution to this would be, well, you just bring them in. But but again, it's a model, right? It's a way of operating. And I think there's a whole, if you look at sort of Caroline Perez-Parado's books around, around the sort of the challenges that women face in society, there's a model there that we've sort of depended on, and there are certain people who have huge vested interest in persisting with running.
Yeah.
That I think is massively destructive in this regard. So there's another example of a sort of, we've built a patriarchal society that seems to offer certainty to certain people.
Yeah.
And yet we can see that it doesn't. And I think that's a very interesting angle you've put on that.
And I think when people often ask me, when they read my book, so what kind of leaders do we need once we accept the unknowability of the future? And I think it is clearly around listening. I think it's very much around the power to convene. So that's to have the right voices around you with license to speak. I mean, I think what's happened in New Zealand in terms of the opposition being specifically invited to be the kind of mind guard for the government during the pandemic. So an active and productive source of dissent and critique. I think that's brilliant. I think it's absolutely brilliant, because it's neither saying it's a crisis, let's all band together. It's saying it's a crisis, we're going to have to make a lot of really big decisions quickly. And we could get it wrong. So we want somebody to cover our backs. We're conscious that nobody's going to get it all right. We're conscious that we're moving really, really fast. So actually, the biggest value that an opposition can bring to a government in that context is to be a critical friend. And instead, what we have in this country is the opposition is kind of disabled because any critique looks unpatriotic. Actually, criticism, we all know this from our personal relationships. The person who dares to say, actually, you're getting this wrong, you don't know this, or you're too this, or you're too that. These people are our friends. They're trying to protect us from ourselves. And governments need that every bit as much as individuals do. Boards need it. CEOs need it. There is nobody there with the magic key that gives them instant knowledge or wisdom. And it's simply infantile of us to expect leaders to have that. And it's, absurd for them to imagine that they might develop it all by themselves.
And I think actually it's interesting, if you go back in history, if you look at the role of the court jester.
Yeah.
That's a risk management play, which is, and it's cloaked in the fact that it's done in a comedic way, but they're allowed to criticize the more often than not king because, that was recognized, that was a valuable piece. Nobody else is allowed to, but they can, because they do it through a manner that is viewed to be acceptable because it's comedic and silly, but it's a way of pointing out the errors, albeit that if you overstep the mark, you may not find yourself in position for very long, but at least there was a risk management piece, and we lost that somewhere along the way in a world where you're either with us or you're against us.
Yeah, I do quite a lot of work with boards, and I think that it is an absolutely crucial thing in good boards that there is debate and exploration. And I think good boards know that, and bad CEOs militate against it. So, and what we have, in fact, in Parliament, of course, is just a kind of simulation of that. Because it isn't an argument to work together towards a shared understanding. It's just become a Punch and Judy show. And it isn't about let's together try to find the right thing to do. It's just posturing and keeping score. And I think that's really a derogation of democracy. And it's horrible.
And you can see that in the way the seats are set out. Right? It's not a structure that's designed for collision. It's literally two sets of seats facing each other in a sort of gladiatorial combat. So we shouldn't be surprised that it produces those. If that's the architecture, the rest of the structures around that will be similar.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's, as I say, I think it's the wrong mental model. And it's quite interesting because some of it, of course, is based on an adversarial legal system. And it's very striking that the legal system in itself has been moving over the last 20 to 30 years much more towards mediation, restorative justice, much more collaborative forms of dispute resolutions, in the recognition that actually in complex disputes, for one side to walk away with everything and the rest to walk out with nothing is unhelpful. It's not justice. Right. And I think that's as true for government as it is true for business, as it is true for the legal system.
Final question from me, because we could go on forever and this has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you in advance. But final question is clearly we need to finish on a positive note.
Yes.
And in a time of sort of, uncertainty, what is it? What would be your sort of positive thing that people can take away and that they can embrace to make sure that we can, not be too scared about all the negative things that we've talked about?
Well, I think that people have tremendous knowledge and wisdom. And it's important for us to remember two things. One is that experts know a lot and we shouldn't dismiss them. But the other thing is that when they know that their decisions matter, people are extremely thoughtful in the choices that they make. And we've seen this in the Citizens' Assembly, for example, in Ireland. We've seen it in experiments in democracy around the world for the last 20 years. And so I think where we have reason to hope is that people are much more creative, much more imaginative, much more thoughtful, and much more adaptive than many of our institutions allow them to be. And so I think it's really fundamental that all of them start paying attention to the intelligence that resides inside of them. There is enormous collective intelligence in our country, in our companies, and in our communities. And the job for leadership is to reach out and listen. We don't need a lot of simplified, biased, inadequate technology to make good decisions. We need to use the most complex instrument in the known universe, which is the human brain, and use it well. And not give up on ourselves, but understand that we have huge capacity we haven't really even begun to apply to the problems in front of us.
Wow. That was lovely and uplifting. And look, thank you so much for writing the books that you write and the work that you do, because it's always thought provoking. And as listeners will have realized, there's a heck of a lot to think about. And it was one of those books that I had to stop and reread, and I will be reading again off the back of this conversation. So thank you for writing those. And above all, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to share some fascinating stories and insights from the work that you've done.
Well, it's been my pleasure. It's been a really fun conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Margaret for appearing and to you for listening. If you're interested in finding out more about Margaret's books, including Uncharted, you'll find details of that in the show notes, together with links to her TED Talks and some of the other articles she's written. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find this wherever you get your quality audio content on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you had a few minutes to leave a review for the show, that helps maintain its profile, allows other people to find it, and also allows me to continue to attract the kind of high quality guests I've managed to get thus far. I will be back with another episode of this show very, very soon. But in the meantime, please stay safe. Thanks for listening.